Okay, here we are. We're going to get started. I am Lakshmi Ramasubramanian, and I am the incoming president of ACSP. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Sara Bronin to deliver her keynote address at our conference. Sara is an architect, attorney, professor, and policymaker. She has many accomplishments and successes to her credit. I would like to highlight here that she is the founder of Desegregate Connecticut, a coalition that has successfully advanced statewide zoning reforms. Additional details about Sara can be found on her website, sarabronin.com. Sara's talk today is titled, "We Can No Longer Not Know." Without further delay, here is Sara. Please join me in welcoming Sara and noting your comments in the chat. Sara will speak for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have time for a couple of questions. Thanks. Sara, over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the ACSP for hosting. Hopefully you can see this in good mode. I'm not sure if it's, as I'm looking at it, whether it's showing up in presenter mode or not, but hopefully you guys can see at least some of this easily. So the title of my talk is "We Can No Longer Not Know." And I really, as many of you know, I'm new to the planning educator community. I came just last year to Cornell from law school, where I was for 15 years. And as I've been doing more empirical research and more research that really implicates some of the fundamentals of land use planning and zoning, I've gotten to, I guess, really frustrated by the lack of data and by the lack of information. And I sort of feel that as a planning community and as a society as a whole, we don't really have the information we need to make good decisions. And so as I'm thinking about my new role as a planning educator, joining all of you in that wonderful profession, I'm thinking about what our role is in trying to ensure that we can all work together to have better decision making, better information to make decisions. And so that's the topic of my talk today. It's really about why don't we have this information, and what can we do about it? And to kind of frame this discussion, I wanted to talk about something that really has nothing to do with planning, which is the Human Genome Project. So it's something that we've probably all heard about over the years, and maybe some of you have done some impressive study of this, but I didn't know so much about it before I started digging a little bit more as I've been thinking about this topic and trying to see, well, what other similar projects have happened where people get together and say, enough is enough, we need better information to make decisions. And this to me is the one that really showcases what people can do, what researchers can do, and professors and scientists can do when they work together to advocate for a set of data, a set of information that is very publicly important. So we all know why the genomes are important. Probably don't need to go into that, but a little bit about the history of that project. It really started in 1988 when the Academy of Sciences convened a committee to develop recommendations for such a project. In 1990, it was funded a couple of years later. In 1990, the federal government said, this is so important that we're going to house it in two of our agencies. There's the whole federal government apparatus that started to conduct this research, but also to fund private researchers to feed into the data that was being collected to develop the human genome. Over a period of 3 5-year plans starting in 1990 that started the process of developing, okay, how are we coding this? How are we standardizing the inputs who's doing what aspect of the genome, and really started that coordination process. The project actually finished 2 years early in 2003. And the total cost was $2.7 billion, which was actually less than the projected $3 billion over a 15-year period or 13-year period here. That's really not bad for what was created. Overall, there were 2,800 different researchers internationally who worked on this. And here's the full list. It's everyone from the Max Planck Institute to Stanford and University of Washington, Cold Spring Harbor, German Research Center. They're all over the world map. And it was a project that brought together researchers from all over to really hone in on this publicly accessible data. So the impact of this, again, it's housed here at the U.S. National Institutes of Health. There's so many implications, and was not even worth going through each and every one on a slide. We know what the value of that resource has been to the scientific community, to our ability to research disease, to our ability to understand how we age, how we grow, how we eat, how we live. The implications were significant. And just the ton of research that's come out of it is again, something that we benefit from every day. I'll put the Human Genome Project in its own category, really, because it is the kind of thing that I think the planning community should start to advocate for and should really start to coalesce around. I will also note, however, that we have another resource where we are feeding data into one common set of data that we all use in our, probably many of us use in our research, which is the census. And again, many 38,000 general purpose local governments, 50 states, the territories, we all feed into this national publicly available data set, which has been a significant investment by the federal government, which has been recognized as a resource for extended and multifaceted interdisciplinary research, and especially research over time, because we collect the census at periods. That has been significant for its utility. And so the census presents another model for large-scale federal government-funded resources, which are open data and which benefit all of us perhaps more directly than the Human Genome Project does. So my question today is really, couldn't planning benefit from that kind of investment? I think the answer, we could all say, of course it could. And what are the implications? What kind of outcomes could we improve on if we actually knew how land patterns were developed, how natural hazard risks emerged, where historic, tribal, and cultural resources actually are, and perhaps most dear to my heart, where the legal frameworks that dictate all of these apply, and to what extent they constrain the kind of land use and economic and social outcomes that we see in our society today. So again, thinking about a resource, a single resource that has federally supported and managed data on a wide variety of topics could lead to better outcomes in our climate response, could lead to better outcomes in equity, could help us understand housing opportunity, which is something I'll talk more about in my example. Could lead to improved understandings of employment patterns, although geographically, we may be a little bit upended because of COVID and this strange time that we're in right now, where people's employment may or may not be at the places that they used to be. And finally, the protection of what we care about. And I'll just say that very generally. But what I really mean is to include environmental resources, natural resources, tribal, cultural, and historic resources. The things that we care about are being threatened because we don't know what the threats are and where they are and how they come into conflict with these resources. So just wanted to say a few words about why I've been thinking about this and why I feel like it's really an urgent need for us to take a leadership role as planning educators in this space. So as Lakshmi mentioned, I founded an organization called Desegregate Connecticut. You can look it up. It's desegregatect.org is our website. It's a coalition. So this is our team, mostly young people, lots of students, a coalition of almost 80 organizations. And we are working together to change something very specific in this state of Connecticut, which is zoning laws, both at the local level and at the statewide level. And zoning laws, as you know, are the laws that govern really everything that gets built in this country. Almost everything, I should say, because like Texas, where I'm from, there's a lot of unincorporated areas, not at all subject to zoning. In Houston, where I was born, has no zoning whatsoever. So maybe not every single building that gets built, but a lot of it. And certainly in Connecticut, every inch of the state is covered by zoning. So when we were going through this process, people asked it when we started in June 2020, really in response to George Floyd's murder, people kept asking us, well, why do you want to change our zoning laws? Can you even tell us what our zoning codes say? And the reality is we couldn't answer for them in any clear and easy to understand way what the zoning code in their town said, what their zoning codes in the region said, or even how we zoned as a state. There had been some rudimentary research done in previous years on Connecticut zoning codes, but they weren't really to the level of detail that we could really show people that there's a reason to change zoning laws. And so I guess in tandem with our advocacy side and legislative political side, we started on the process of looking at zoning codes. Ultimately, we had about 40 people who were inputting data into these codes. We have 180 zoning jurisdictions in Connecticut, 32,000 pages of zoning data. There were 2,622 zoning districts that we found in all of these pages. And what we did was we coded them into GIS layers that had not been assembled for all the towns. And in fact, in many cases, the zoning codes, not many, in a few cases, the zoning codes were, the zoning maps were drawn by hand, and we had to manually create GIS layers. We had a great team member from UConn's Clear Institute doing that. But the level of work that it required to collect these maps from individual towns, then to harmonize them, then to go back to the towns and say, this zoning layer that you have in your GIS file that you sent to us, it doesn't exist in the zoning code. Is it a real layer? Is it not a real layer? What's going on here? So we had so much, I guess I would say, dirty data and so much data that was wrong or incomplete that it was quite astonishing. As we were doing that, we wanted to know, because our organization really focuses on housing, what the different aspects of housing related zoning are. So we started combing through these codes, looking at what size housing units or what number of units are allowed in each zoning district, whether public hearings are allowed, what the minimum lot size was, the maximum density per acre, the minimum parking requirements. That is my favorite topic. So I won't get started on that, but that's very important. How municipalities or zoning jurisdictions defined affordable housing, what the maximum number of bedrooms and number of units was. And then we did the same or similar deep dives into accessory apartments. Where were those allowed? Were they public hearings or not? Were there minimum parking requirements? Were there owner occupancy restrictions? A lot of those actually. Were there elderly only, family requirements, employee requirements? What was the maximum unit size, the maximum number of bedrooms, and the minimum lot size, which was different than the minimum lot size for individual principal use housing. And only after going through all of this data, and so we started in October, we actually finished this because there were so many helping hands in January. We launched our zoning atlas January 2021. And here's an example of what you can now see, which is available online, showing just as a basic matter where 1, 2, 3, and 4 or more family housing are allowed. So this is the New Haven area, which some of you may be familiar with. New Haven is a central city surrounded by suburbs that are much wealthier than New Haven. Here's where 2 family is allowed as of right. And as you can see, we get down to the lot level here. So we actually don't, the zoning districts are so carefully mapped, thanks to Connecticut Data Collaborative, I should say, who actually did inputted all of this data that we collected into a public user interface. Here's where 3 family housing is allowed as of right, that's without public hearings, and then 4 family housing. So you can now see clearly on this map what we could not explain to people when we embarked on this project in June, which is clearly the suburbs around New Haven, except for East Haven, West Haven to some extent, do not allow any multifamily housing as of right. Sometimes do not allow it at all. In the case of, I can see Bethany, Woodbridge, Seymour, North Branford, Branford, and Orange as of right, which means essentially that there is almost no 4 or more family housing in those neighborhoods. As for the state as a whole, now the zoning atlas shows there's 91% of land that's single family housing as of right. It shows that 81% of land that's zoned for residential, primarily residential uses, has a minimum lot size of 1 acre or more. This is astonishing. 50% has a lot size of 2 acres or more. And here's where here's where 4 or more family housing is allowed as of right. And again, compared to this, it's astonishing. So there's a lot of other, and I can put a link in the chat to a paper that is coming out about all of the different, just really the basics, like what does the zoning atlas show on accessory apartments. It shows that lots of towns allow accessory dwelling units, but restrict them pretty significantly. It shows that a huge difference between public hearing requirements for single family and 2 family housing, differences in lot size requirements, lot coverage requirements, actually showing that height maximums were almost universal. 85 to 95% of all districts require have a maximum height, which limits the amount of housing that can be built. And then finally, parking requirements, which are, as I said, my favorite topic. And I'm working with a colleague here at Cornell AAP and Nick Klein, hopefully on a forthcoming project about this parking issue and the amount of new housing that can be created if we just lift this one regulatory barrier. So we do zone by 1,000 cuts. We were able to figure that out in Connecticut through this painstaking effort of coding manually this text data. I hope that we'll be able to use what we've done here to develop a machine learning tool that would enable us to read zoning codes from all around the country. If we can do that, then what we could have is a national zoning data set, as long as we can get the layers and the codes, but we need somebody to coordinate that. I've been contacted by other people in other states who want to do the same thing for their state. So I will be developing and handing off how to code, how to create the zoning atlas in your state. But we need more than these sort of ad hoc efforts. And so this project is one of the reasons why I think that we need the kind of information that civilians like myself shouldn't just be creating on the fly and for advocacy purposes. but really could feed into a bigger data set, because the implications of understanding even this one aspect of how our land is regulated are vast. So of course, this tells us where we can provide housing, where housing can be built, but it also could tell us where what the links are between zoning and school quality. It can show us whether we are overbuilding or underbuilding in climate risk areas where there are climate risks. It can tell us whether towns are satisfying their federal burdens to provide fair housing opportunities for everybody. It can also help us understand the markets and how housing as a market is working or not working in a particular area. But it's not fair that only Connecticut has this data. I really do think that this is a potential area where, if as planners we said this is an area of significant national priority, if we took advantage of the winds of change in DC, actually allowing federal government to think about things like zoning and land use and climate change, I really do think that we could make a difference with our voices. Just a second smaller project that also underscores this issue for me has been a project I've been working on, which really just resulted from me wanting to update a single number in the book that I use for historic preservation law class that I teach. And the number was, how many towns have historic districts? We had a study from early 1990, I think early 1990s, which said that there were 2,300 historic district commissions across the United States. And so surely things have changed since then. And setting out to ask and answer this simple question, which is a regulatory question, but of course it's overlaid on geographic areas which either do or do not have historic regulation, has absolutely been a crazy project. So I had a research assistant spend over 200 hours just to ask, does this town have regulations or not? And first we went through this list of certified local governments, which is a national designation for local governments with historic districts, went through state historic preservation offices to see if they had records and lists of towns with historic regulation, went to the statewides, and then finally in the many states, I would say over half of the states where none of these entities had a simple list of entities in their state with historic districts. We actually went through every municipal code in every town for every state that did not have the preceding 3 bullet points information from those. And we found actually that there are over 4,000 historic towns with historic districts, 4,038. So that was exciting. We can now put the number in to the casebook, or we did because it just came out. But there are a lot of implications for this. Where historic district regulation is adopted is really important. We found that we're doing, I have another project drawing from this project looking at the correlations between certain characteristics of states and the prevalence of historic district regulation. We're seeing the strongest correlation between median property values and the acceptance of historic districts. We're seeing not so much correlation by race, a little bit by income, and interestingly, by people who voted for Trump versus Biden. So if a state was more likely to vote for Trump, is less likely to have a high percentage of their towns with historic districts. Just using the recent election figures as a measure. So I do think that there are political, social, other implications of the places where land use regulations are adopted and what they exactly say. But the simple question of which towns do and do not have historic regulations, something that should be easily answerable, was just not available. And I should say, we haven't even gotten to the question of where these historic resources are actually located, not to mention cultural or tribal resources. There is no single geographic data set, certainly not for the country, not for any state, as far as I know, of local historic districts, local historic landmarks, state historic districts and landmarks, and the National Register, which has been digitized in the sense that the applications for the National Register have been digitized and placed in a searchable database. But many times these applications are not text searchable because they were created in the 1970s and 80s, and they were submitted on paper and not electronically. So the process of digitization of our historic resources is something that's important to me and of big interest to the historic preservation community. And if I am confirmed for this role that Lakshmi mentioned at the Advisory Council on Historic Preservation, it will be a big priority to start the process of advocating for the significant investment that's needed to digitize at a minimum the National Register of Historic Places. We cannot protect what we don't know. If we don't know where something is located, if we don't know what the threats are, then we will not be able to protect it. And in particular, my concern for many historic places is the threats from natural hazards. So if you think about the historic places issue as a sort of standalone issue, we need to not only know where they are located, we need to know what the sea level rise risks are, what the wildfire risks are to those places. And those maps need to be coordinated and overlaid. They also need to go across state boundaries. Connecticut happens to have, thanks to funds from Hurricane Harvey, happens to have a map of historic districts along the coastal communities. And we have found, the State Historic Preservation Office has found that tens of thousands of resources are at risk. We also happen to have a sea level rise institute that has mapped where sea level rise is occurring up and down the coast. So those two things were able to be meshed, but I don't think that many other states have that kind of resource. And again, it's not really fair that Connecticut does and other states don't. We also need that to be federally coordinated. So I'll just close with a couple of thoughts about why I think now is the time for us to push for a major 10, 15, 20-year project on digitizing these various aspects of information that affect whether we are effective as planners, as regulators, as advocates. I think, as I mentioned before, the Biden administration seems to have some interest in the natural hazards, some interest in housing policy and in local zoning policies and land use policies. The historic preservation community as an advocacy arm is well positioned right now and is very poised, I would say, to advocate for digitization of their resources, the resources that they care about. So I think from a political perspective and from an advocacy perspective, it would be a sound time to do it. I know that we're now at this point, when I planned this talk, I didn't know whether we would be behind or in front of the infrastructure bill passing or not passing, but that has been, or could have been, might have been an opportunity for us to really raise our voices to talk about the need for a coordinated data set across many different dimensions of policy. In terms of where it could go in a number of different federal agencies, but it would require similar to the Human Genome Project, for one or maybe two federal agencies to take the lead on developing for a couple of years, just like that project, standards for harmonization, a list of the things that actually need to be collected, again, just like that project, and a timeline for doing that. Of course, funding has to be required, but the reality is if we don't start advocating for this now, we're going to continue to not know, and that is going to be deeply problematic. for all of us. So I'll just close by saying, why not? When have we ever gotten together for this kind of effort? And I think I will leave it there, and we'll look forward to questions, comments, and rotten tomatoes.
Sara, thank you so much for this lovely talk. You make me very happy because you link themes that are not only important to me, but to many, many of us in planning land, right? You're talking about publicly accessible data. You're talking about the value of using data to do advocacy work and to do political action work, which is all resonating very well with our over 100 attendees here today. The questions are coming in, and I know you have to rush to teach a class. So friends, please put your questions down and I will take it upon myself to send the question to Sara and make sure you get the answers back in case we don't get to them today. And while you're saying, congratulations and thank you to Sara, put in the chat your appreciation and also say where you're joining us from today so we know the range of audiences that are here today. So please do that in the chat, put your questions in the Q&A. I know you all can multitask, and let me start with the first question. And the question is, how do you bridge the gap between telling the story of a problem affecting social equity, example via map, to taking action on the problem and furthering social equity? Can you give a couple of examples of possibilities of how to do this?
Great. So, I mean, this is a little bit to the side but I'm happy to talk about this. And really, probably my best example is the Desegregate Connecticut initiative that I mentioned inspired the zoning atlas and the research related to it. So for that entity, what we've done is we've taken the atlas itself and we've used it to justify zoning reform proposals in the state. So by the way, this is my outside of academia sort of passion project, I guess, for the last year and a half. So this is it just happened to fold into research. But what we've done with that is we've, for example, for accessory dwelling units. So in the last legislative session, the state legalized accessory dwelling units, which for those who don't know and maybe didn't catch my image, it's a secondary unit on a principal dwelling lot where the principal dwelling is larger than the smaller accessory dwelling unit. And the idea is, as California and other states have done, you legalize these, you will quickly create more housing. So California in 3 years saw an 11-fold increase in accessory apartments. So Connecticut legalized them with one important exception, which allows towns to opt out if they've gone through this multi-step process to do so, but they only have a limited amount of time to do that. So we're hoping that lots of them don't. But the opt-out is a reason that we still have to advocate at the local level. So what we've done is for any town where we've heard even an inkling of an opt-out, we've created a series of town-specific materials which use the zoning atlas to show, here's how your town zones for accessory apartments. Here are the things, using screenshots of the atlas. Here are the things that you do allow and that you don't allow, and kind of go through how that town could benefit from accessory apartments. So we use it in advocacy that way. In the upcoming legislative session, we will be, we've announced our legislative agenda yesterday. We will be pushing for equitable transit-oriented communities. And part of that has been creating transit-specific materials for every train station in the state. We're almost done with that process. Once we are, we'll post them all online, showing where 4 or more family housing is allowed around the train station, and also emphasizing for each community whether single family large lot minimum zoning is allowed around the train station. That's something that we have marked in the zoning atlas. If you go to that, and I should probably put it in the chat here. If you go to that website, you can see little markers around, little circles around the individual train stations. And when you click on the left, you can toggle back and forth, and you'll see that many train stations allow large lot single family zoning right around the train station. And that's, I guess, what they thought was a good idea when we know that it's not. So those are equity, and our transit proposal requires a 10% minimum deed restricted affordability requirement. So we are using the zoning atlas to tell the story of are using it actively in advocacy to tell the story about how specific towns or specific sites like these train stations can be redeveloped in better ways than what we're doing now. We've also been using it to combine the environmental argument, showing that that 80% figure of 1 acre zoning, which results in sprawl, which results in a depletion of our farmland and forest land. That has been, again, deeply problematic for a state that used to depend on its agriculture and that needs its forests to continue to clean our air. So we've also been using the data in ways to make that environmental argument too.
Thank you, Sarah. There's a pair of questions from my colleagues here that both talk about working on building searchable databases, one in California and one in Florida, of actually assembling and organizing information, and generally asking the question, why aren't more states doing this work and sharing it, more importantly, sharing it and making it publicly accessible? So just asking about, like, what are the barriers to states doing this work? Why aren't they doing it? And how do we sort of navigate that?
So from a legal perspective, any state could do any of this data collection and could request it from local governments. If the federal government, though, says that this is an area of federal concern, that in order for us to understand actually really the economic trajectory, if you care about nothing else, you just care about the economic trajectory of the country, we need to understand where our risks are as a whole, how we're developing, what kind of housing market we have. And again, there's a bunch of people that I can see now in the chat, now that my screen is not shared, who've written about these. I know Andrew Rumbach and disaster law. I mean, there's just too many to mention. But if the federal government said this is a pressing federal priority, they could, as federal government could, as it does with the census, say, state and local governments, you have to report data on topic X. So I don't think that there is I think part of if I skimmed the question correctly to a part of the question was, can states and local governments resist a federal attempt to collect data? And I think from a legal perspective, the answer is probably no. But first, the federal government has to say this is an issue of national concern. And I think that they haven't said that yet, which is why we don't have any of these tools yet. And we're not even really planning for them yet.
So I had a question of my own about the comments you made about the historic preservation data set, right? So the National Park Service certainly collects some of this data, and the tribes themselves collect some of the data about historic sites and locations. And the argument, at least from the tribes, has been that, we really don't want to make this information public outside of the tribe because it makes us vulnerable to harm, right? There's looting and things like that. So we're constantly balancing the trade-offs between making information publicly accessible and sort of protecting sacred sites, for example. And so could you just comment on that tension, perhaps?
Yes, so certainly from a tribal perspective, there is sensitive issues related to resources, artifacts, human remains, sacred sites that have actually been protected in federal law from they're having to disclose. So if you look at the way that federal legal processes work for historic preservation, tribes don't ever have to tell government agencies where exactly the resources that they are concerned with are. They simply have to help the agencies understand by essentially a process of elimination where a general area where their resources would be affected. You're right that tribes are concerned based on experiences they've had in the past with fully disclosing exact locations of their sites, as well as the nature of the site that's significant to them. This is a separate topic too, but for that reason, there has been a call in the tribal community to have a different criteria for tribal historic resources. That would be something that the National Park Service would have to articulate through its regulations. And I'm hopeful that with the incoming nominee, Chuck Sams, whose hearing I watched on Tuesday morning, that he will be interested in considering this and helping to move that process forward. The issue of mapping tribal sites is perhaps hampered from full precise mapping for that reason. But on the other hand, in the same way that we've been able through federal law to navigate confidentiality of sites against the need to protect them and the need to understand generally where they are, I think we can probably deal with that from a mapping perspective too.
Thank you. Do we have time, Sarah, for one more question?
Oh yeah, I have until 2:30, I thought.
Oh, good. Wonderful. Yeah. Then we can keep going. This is a question that asks about when we get focused on data collection, like, what else are we not doing? So I'll read the question as it's stated so that we can dig into it. With Desegregate Connecticut in mind, can you elaborate on where the construction of zoning databases fits in with the political process of desegregating Connecticut? What kind of impact might it make? What else is needed? Has data collection taken precedence over other important ingredients to success, or has other work been taking place in parallel? Really, thank you.
Yes, yeah. So that question is from Rolf Pendle, I think, who himself has pioneered zoning surveys at the national level and zoning research. So I feel a little bit, humbled to answer that question because he was one of the first people who really pioneered this. So in our research, what we've done is we've done it in parallel with the advocacy. So I've had, this research team, and the research on the zoning atlas is over in terms of the data collection. I update it when local government changes its regulations, which, believe it or not, we have seen over the last 6 months. We've seen local jurisdictions regulate to be more inclusive for housing. Several of them have changed their accessory apartments regulations, have changed parking requirements. I hope they've said West Hartford in response to the Desegregate Connecticut advocacy efforts. So I do track those changes now, one-man band in the data entry side, but we have the bulk of it already done. The other kinds of advocacy efforts, so Desegregate Connecticut is really almost akin to a political campaign in that it has this research side, it has a number of events, and I encourage you to go to the events page on our website because we have our national experts on transit, minimum lot sizes, talking about our research in these areas. If you're interested in getting a deep dive into Connecticut, these events are always really great. We did one on Tuesday called Land Use Policy is Climate Policy. And we had researchers and advocacy organizations talking about that. But the events have been an important part of the advocacy and the public engagement side. But from the advocacy side, we've done We've raised money for a series of videos where people tell their story about zoning. We've done rallies. We've had press conferences. We've had a number of press conferences and similar events. When we had the public hearing, we used advocacy tech, which texts people, text zoning to 313131. Then you're on our mailing list, and we text you when it's your time to testify at the public hearing, which was a 24-hour all-night public hearing in favor of the zoning reform bill that passed. And 70% of the testimony was in favor. We had over 300 people submit testimony in favor of it. So the advocacy side was kind of running on its own as again, almost like a campaign-like feature. And 70 op-eds. We made sure that people were writing to their local papers, to the state's more regional papers, and so on. So the advocacy side, and I think it will continue this year of our thinking about this as education, research and advocacy all combined, and they're running on parallel tracks. Now the research has shifted to really more, now that we have this data, what can we do with it? So I mentioned the research with Nick. I'll be working with the Urban Institute, hopefully on the machine learning project. There's other projects. I want to look at that zoning restrictiveness index, the Glaser-Gurico zoning restrictiveness index, now that we don't have to rely on surveys, but we can rely on actual data to see if we can do an update of that, and so on. So there's a lot of directions that this can go, and I'm excited about that. And I should say, put a little plug in, we are hiring at Cornell in this area, in the area of data collection, in the area of data analysis. So Nick is on the search committee, as am I. So if you're interested in becoming our colleague, feel free to chime in and shoot us a note.
There's one more question in the chat, Sarah, from Julia Bronin, and I think you may see it as well. So would you mind stating the question and then answering it? And maybe that can be our last question.
Great, sure. So I believe it is, what avenues do we have to invest in the expertise to synthesize and analyze information relating to functional comprehensive planning, and what avenues do we have to build out multi-level planning processes that would actually use it? So I guess, for both of these answers, I think if we have not as a community really advocated for this kind of, I do think that the standard has to be a national standard. Again, it can't just be Connecticut that has this data, and then Utah who's going to do the same thing, and Colorado who's going to do it. It cannot be just these few states that decide to do this. We do need a national standard, and I think the expertise that's needed is really the time and investment that it will take to have a full coordinated approach, again, potentially through a federal agency, to develop that 15-year, the 3-5-year plan, to develop the protocols and standards. I guess we don't necessarily know what expertise we need until we've done that as a community and as a country. I also think that we do need, just on your point about, oh no, I just lost it. Oh yes, multifunctional planning processes like the Human Genome Project. We don't know how researchers are always going to use that Human Genome Project data. What we do know is that they can download it and use it for a wide variety of research. So what we need, I think, is like a census of land use characteristics and regulations over a set period of time, where we start with this baseline and then we update it every 5 or 10 years, and require towns and require states to upload their information. And we have no idea how it will be used, what kinds of planning processes it will be used for, what kinds of research it will be used for, what kinds of connections that can be made. So, I guess my answer to that is, I don't know. And that's part of the problem, isn't it? And so I hope that we can all work together, in some form or fashion. If I do get confirmed, I'll be working on this from the federal agency side and trying to raise awareness about our little narrow piece in historic preservation. But I do think it's time for us to really make, maybe for the first time, this kind of concerted push for this kind of effort. So thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to continuing to become a fuller part of this community, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Sara, for taking your time to talk to us today, and we look forward to continuing to collaborate with you on these efforts. Thank you. Enjoy the conference, everyone. See you. Bye.
Bye-bye.